Good morning, church family. Good to see you all out there. I am Ashley Hamstra, and I just want to welcome all of you today, whether you're physically here in the sanctuary, watching the live stream, or tuning in later. Welcome. I'm going to run through a few announcements. The first one is the tear-offs in the bulletin. There's that little tab you can tear off. You can update your contact information, submit a prayer request, ask a question, ask about getting involved in a ministry. Just a good communication tool. Next up, we have a membership transfer. Doug and Vanessa Wheeler are transferring from Sandpoint here. Doug was just playing the music, and I believe Vanessa has a baby due in March. We're so excited they're joining our family. This is the second reading. All in favor of them joining our local family here, say yay or raise your hand. And we have a basket for them, so. Okay, there he is down there. Okay. All right, and then next up, I'm going to call up Kathy Dutro, and she's going to tell us about our food drive. Thank you, Kathy.
Hi. Last week we announced that we're going to do Thanksgiving boxes for families in needs. And last week we thought we had 20 to 22 families who wanted the baskets. Over the last week it has grown to 36. So it's going to serve about 148 people in those 36 families. So what we would like to do is this basket will be sitting out in the lobby. And on each card is written something that we need for the food baskets. You can make financial donations, that's fine. But if you'd like to go shopping, for instance, you may be able to buy a turkey at Fred Meyer or Costco or someplace else, and you buy one and you get 50% off the other one or whatever. So it makes better sense for you guys to maybe buy the turkeys and donate them. Anyway, the sizes and everything are written on cards that will be put out in the lobby. Also next week, on Sunday, from 2 to 4, we will be meeting in the Fellowship Center, and we're going to assemble those 36 boxes. So we need about 5 to 7 volunteers to help us, and it would be probably a really good project for a parent-child or grandparent and child combination. And then on Monday and Tuesday we will be distributing the baskets or boxes to the individual families. So if you're able to volunteer any 3 of those times, that would be great. If you're donating shelf-stable things, you can bring them to church next week. Otherwise, you could bring them to us on Sunday. And we will have a few coolers here to put things in that have to be kept frozen or refrigerated. So keep that in mind. And I'd like you to look around. Look at who's in front of you, who's behind you, and there's maybe 6 or 8 people up in the balcony. This is a total of about 100 to 150 people in the sanctuary right now. So that's how many people we're trying to provide a Thanksgiving meal to. So thank you, and Ashley showed you the basket. It'll be sitting out in the lobby. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. Next up, I'm going to meet Kate Bird, and she's going to talk to us about UCA Upper Columbia Conference.
Happy Sabbath, everybody. So I'm coming as a representative of the senior class, and unfortunately, because of COVID, our fundraising opportunities have been cut really short. So we are struggling to raise money for graduation and our class trip and stuff like that. So over the course of the next few months, we'll be hosting a few fundraiser brunches on Sundays, and hopefully we'll be able to let you all know when those are. But basically, this Sunday, tomorrow, we'll be having one of them, and it's going to be crepes, and there's going to be some pancakes and waffles as well. And basically it's $10 to enter at the door, and you just get a free meal and get to sit and talk with people. And we would really appreciate it if you guys would come and help support our senior class. Thank you.
Thanks, Kate. All right, I think next up, Pastor Jeremiah.
Well, good morning. We are excited to receive your feedback in a couple of different ways. First of all, I don't know how many of you saw the last Sabbath at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, a survey came across your emails. If you haven't seen that yet, please check your emails. Signed and sent. All right, some of you have already responded. Thank you. We are asking for your feedback, your input into the worship service, and there's a fairly comprehensive survey. If there are individuals who have hidden talents that we would like to make unhidden, that you think should be unhidden, we would love your feedback on everything from if you're willing or gifted in doing a special music to all sorts of different creative ideas for worship. So please make sure and check your emails, fill that out. If you don't do email, we do have some hard copies in the lobby if you'd prefer to fill it out by hand. So thank you for taking the time to do that. And then next Sabbath, November 20, we're going to have a church vision meeting where we're asking you all to be praying and asking the Holy Spirit to give you ideas. In your bulletin there is an insert. We have identified 5 major areas where our gifts and talents as a church line up with the needs in our community and with what people are looking for in a church. So we want to bathe this whole thing in prayer. We want you to come prepared with ideas. So we're going to have a competition to see which one of these groups, we're going to divide up into these various groups: health, physical and mental, service, family life, recreation, and then we're starting something new called life groups. So if you want a head start on that, it's anything you enjoy doing in life, make it intentional. Make it intentional. Do it yourself, another friend from church, and someone from outside the church, and go do it. Whether you love to eat out, whatever you enjoy doing, we're going to try to make all of life intentional in reaching out to others and discipleship. So any creative ideas, anything you love doing that you think, hey, I could do this with 1, 2, 3, 5, however many people in the church, and I'd love to do that. That's what life groups are all about, is engaging each one of us in that. So we're going to break into these 5 groups when you come. We'll talk a little bit more about it next week at the vision meeting, 3 o'clock, and then we're going to break out into think tank groups. And you'll be able to share the ideas that the Holy Spirit has laid on your heart, and then we'll come back together and collect those, and we'll begin intentionally applying those as a church as we see common themes and threads throughout the different ideas that come back. And then following that, we're going to have winners and losers, right? And so if you get into a heated debate in your group, we can just carry it right over, because Ane is going to be hosting a church-wide social event. We're going to have a game night. So if you lose during the discussion in your group, you can go beat the person at the game night a little later in the evening, all right? So anyway, come join us for an afternoon of visioning, seeking God's will, of how we can do better as a church in reaching our community and building up our discipleship and evangelism programs. And then stay around and enjoy an evening of fellowship and games with us next Saturday.
Thank you. Just a couple more things. One, the Sabbath after Thanksgiving, so I think that's in 2 Sabbaths, if my math is correct. We're going to do a mulligan stew. We've done those in the past, so if you're interested, just bring something to add to the stew. So that would be something that a canned item, or something that's already washed and chopped, just so that we can dump it into the big pot out front. And last, as many of you know, this is a Pacific U weekend. 2 commonly asked questions I get is, 1, what is a Pacific U? And 2, what is a Pacific U weekend? A Pacific U is a kind of tree. It's not a rare tree, but it's also not common. I'd call it uncommon. Nick Peterson, I think, probably knows more about it than I do. He like smiles. It's predominantly along the Pacific coast in the Northwest. But we also have a pocket here in Coeur d'Alene. And it's kind of a funky Dr. Seuss looking tree, and then it also has medicinal properties that's been used to treat people. So it's a fun, interesting tree. And a Pacific U weekend is our church once a quarter hosts a seminar weekend where we have someone come and visit. We have Dr. Thomas this weekend. He's up from Walla Walla. And they give a series of talks Friday night, Sabbath morning, Sabbath afternoon. And this weekend, Dr. Thomas is talking about religion and science. Last night, he spoke about religion and spirituality, and what is religion, and can you be spiritual and not religious? That's, I think, a common question that we hear nowadays, and if you're curious about what he had to say, that's on YouTube and Facebook. So if you weren't here last night, you can watch it, and he did Sabbath school this morning as well. And then he's doing the sermon today. After church, we're providing a lunch in the fellowship hall, actually the gymnasium. It's a Thanksgiving theme, so I hope you guys are hungry. And Alyssa Wallace and Mihaila Kazan are kind of spearheading it, but there's a whole team of people over there prepping lunch, so please come join us. And then back here at 2 p.m., Dr. Thomas will be talking about how to have a foundational view of science as a Christian. Thank you, Dr. Thomas, and we're excited to hear more. Thank you.
Got the ball Mommy gave me. That's really cool. May I please hold it? Sure. Wow, it's squishy and it's smooth. I really want to bounce it to see how high it will go. Mommy said not to bounce it inside. Okay. I wonder what it's made out of. It might be made out of clay. It might be made out of plastic. It might be a big ball of rubber band. Ooh, we can cut it open. No. I bet Mommy knows. Jesus knows. Let's ask Jesus.
Sometimes there are problems that we just don't know the answer to. Like this ball. What is it made out of? Sometimes we can try to figure it out. We can hold it, we can touch it, we can cut it open, we can do experiments with it, we can dissect it. But the best way to find out what this is made out of is to go to the one who created it. It's like if you've ever been at Grandma's house and you smell something coming from the kitchen. Oh, it's so good. And she comes out with a big bowl of soup. Oh, and it smells so good. And you get a bowl full and you start eating the soup and you think, wow, this is so yummy. And you finish that bowl and you go back for more. And you know what? You think, man, how did Grandma make this? This is so good. Maybe your mommies and daddies have asked that question. Well, we have to remember that Jesus is the source of all wisdom. He knows the answers because he created everything. So my daughters Amelia and Claire have it right. If you ever have a question, just ask Jesus. Don't forget, come find me after the worship service at the back of the church. With your parents' permission, I have a special treat for each one of you. Okay?
'Tis so sweet to trust in Jesus, just to take him at his word, just to rest upon his promise, just to know thus saith the Lord. Oh, how sweet to trust in Jesus, just to trust his cleansing blood, and in simple faith to plunge me 'neath the healing cleansing blood. Jesus, Jesus, how I trust him, how I prove him more and more. Jesus, Jesus, precious Jesus, oh, for grace to trust him more. Oh, for grace to trust him. I'm so glad I learned to trust thee, precious Jesus, Savior, friend. And I know that thou art with me, will be with me to the end. Amen. It is so lovely to hear you all singing. For our last song, would you stand with us? And as we sing this kind of new rendition of it as well, just let your heart sing and just focus on knowing that through it all, He is with us in it as well.
Grander earth is cleared before, moved by the sound of His voice. Seas that are shaken and stirred can be calmed and broken from mighty God. Through it all, my eyes are on you. Through it all, it is well. Through it all, my eyes are on you, and it is well with me. Far be it from me to not believe, even when my eyes can't see. And this mountain that's in front of me will be thrown into the midst of the sea. And through it all, my eyes are on you. Through it all, it is well. And through it all, my eyes are on you. It is well. It is well. So let go, my soul, and trust in Him. The waves and winds still know His name. So let go, my soul, and trust in Him. The waves and winds still know His name. The waves and winds still know His name. It is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. It is
Thank you, guys. That was beautiful. You can be seated. A couple of things before prayer. One is our offering today is the church budget, the world budget, but the emphasis is on radio ministries. And for many of you, when you hear that, you'll think Voice of Prophecy, HMS Richards, and that ministry is still going on. And then there's the Spanish version, La Voz de la Esperanza, which is also all over the world. On a personal level, that ministry has affected my family in a different way. I don't know if any of you have kind of listened to Adventures in Odyssey when you were kids growing up, or your kids. I was a big fan, had lots of tapes, and this ministry has a podcast called Discovery Mountain. And Michelle Peterson introduced my family to it, and it has taken us by storm. Our kids love it. It's basically, if you think of Adventures in Odyssey, but an Adventist modern version in a podcast form. So this ministry is in our household almost every day. So we're very grateful for that. So that's what the offering is for today. And as usual, during COVID, we have the two boxes in the back. One is for tuition aid for UCA and LCA, and the other one is for tithe and offering. And one other note about the lunch after this is we have a few tables set up around the perimeter that they're desks basically from the school. So if anyone wants to eat physically distanced for COVID, we do have accommodations so that you don't have to eat in a group as well. So we hope you can join us. And with that, please bow your heads for prayer. Glorious Father, loving Father, the Alpha and Omega, we are gathered here today to praise your name. We're gathered here today to encourage one another in our walk with you and to help each other as we journey through this broken world. As we listen to Dr. Thomas today, help us to be present. Help us to clean out the clutter that can distract us, and help us to really listen for that still small voice so that you can impress upon us what you want us to hear and to apply to our lives today. And Lord, also today, I just want to give you a huge thanks for just several church members have been recovering from COVID or other illnesses. Last night, I saw Odette for the first time, and that really warmed my soul, and I know that there are others that are now home. But there are others that, are falling sick as well. So just please be with our community and our world at large. Amen.
I begin today with a story. It's not a very exciting story because it's a story about a fairly mundane happening. Years ago, I knew a congregation that had reached the point where they wanted to fulfill a long-standing dream. A dream of building a new building, a church building for themselves. They had been worshiping in an auditorium for quite a long time. And they came to the point where a new pastor came who had experience with church building. And so they set about the task of raising money and finding an architect and getting a piece of property and agreeing on the colors. You may know that that's often the most contentious of all things. They came up with a very nice design. And they selected a builder. And then came the exciting day when the first workmen showed up on the site to begin construction. And the first people to show up there were surveyors. This was before the days of everything being satellite referenced. And the pastor happened to be there by choice. He arrived there the same time the surveyors did, and as they began to figure out how to situate the building and to figure out where it was going to be, he took them over to an old birch tree that was off to the side of the property. And he pointed out to them that there in the birch tree, the pastor had driven an old railroad spike. And he pointed it out to the surveyors and said, every time you come here, I thought you might be able to reference your instruments from that spike. And so it was that every time that plumb or level needed to be checked, the surveyors would set their instruments up and they would sight them on that fixed point of reference. And so the building was built. I have another story. I was flying in an airplane years ago, and in my life I've done a little too much of that, to get in that aluminum tin can and go rocketing above the earth at 7 miles above everything while you look out a window. It gets to be a bit old if you do it too much. But I was flying one day, flying from Atlanta up to Boston. In Atlanta it was raining. There was cloud cover everywhere. It was raining, and we took off, and as always happens, you climb up through the clouds into the bright sunshine, and we headed on our way north. And I was sitting by the window, something I like to do when I'm flying. And I was reading a book, and I'd look out the window, and I noticed something that I never like to see when I'm flying. And that was I noticed another airplane. When I'm flying up there, I like to think there's nobody else around, but there was another plane. It was off to the side. It seemed to be at about the same altitude, going in the same direction. And for the several hours that we flew, every time I looked out the window, there was that plane. And it struck me at one point, maybe this is all an illusion, because we don't seem to be going anywhere. There's clouds everywhere. That plane is there, we're here, nothing seems to be moving. And you understand that the problem was what? There was no obvious fixed point of reference by which we could judge speed and direction. Having a fixed point of reference is a very important thing when building buildings or when flying in airplanes. It's also a very important thing to have when living life, fixed points of reference. And of course, when living, fixed points of reference are not spikes in trees or some object that's visible from up above. They are ideological things. They are beliefs. They are opinions that we hold. And in the Western world, for the better part of 13 or 1400 years, the accepted primary fixed point of reference has been the belief that there is a divine being whom we call God, who is non-contingent, who has acted within time and space in ways that human beings can see and understand. That's been the reference point from which society has operated. The idea that there is a non-contingent being whose name we spell with a capital G, who is somewhere out there, but who has taken it upon himself to act inside of time and in space, to interact with humans in ways that we can understand. And based on those experiences, we have derived a collection of ideas and beliefs by which we reference our living. You know as well as I that that proposition is in decline in the Western world. That people today are abandoning that proposition. They think it's nonsense. They think it's unprovable. I have been amazed in my life of how often I have run into people who claim to be either agnostic or atheist or even now anti-theist, a different category now, who are not just don't believe in God, but are against the idea of God and campaign against it. See? And it's a sadness to me that the younger the demographic, the more prominent this abandonment of the foundational reference point of Western life has become. And I would like to say a few things about that this morning. And the first one is this, is that let us always keep in mind that a human opinion expressed about God does not change the reality of God. I remember a young man coming to my office years ago, and he sat down, he was quite relaxed, and he told me, he says, Dr. Thomas, he says, I have become an atheist. And he said it with kind of confidence that he felt relieved from all the encumbrances that would come from being a theist in his mind. And I said to him, I said, that's interesting to me, but I said, have you ever thought about the fact that your pronouncement doesn't make it so? The fact that I as a human being announce that there is no God does not change whatever the reality might be. It only changes the way I react to the possibility. And the smile left the young man's face. He hadn't thought about that. But it's true. I may boldly state that there is no God. It doesn't make it so. A second thing I would say is that people say there is no evidence for God. They're looking for evidence to sustain a belief, and that's actually a very good, incredible thing to do. You should not believe things without evidence. But I have found that if you talk to them and ask them more closely, they're looking for empirical evidence. They're looking for some kind of hard evidence that makes belief in God credible. And I would like to say this morning that we ought to keep in mind that empirical evidence does not work in the realm of the supernatural, as far as we know. It works in the cosmos, in the natural world. You can do those kind of experiments, but if you begin to test miracles, you will find you don't get any results because miracles suspend the rules that you're trying to investigate with. People who study this talk about this kind of thing being a category mistake. It's like going to a clothing store and asking for a pizza. There's nothing wrong with the clothing store, and there's nothing wrong with your request for a pizza. The problem is that you're asking for it in the wrong place. They make no profession of making pizza in a clothing store. They might look at you a little bit sideways, wondering what in the world you're thinking, coming in asking for a pizza in a clothing store. Looking for empirical evidence to sustain a belief in God is a category mistake. It's like asking, well, how much does yellow weigh? Any of you know? Or what shape is green? See, these are category mistakes. They are questions that don't apply. And trying to establish belief in God by empirical evidence is highly problematic because we do not know that empirical evidence applies in the possibility of the supernatural, and God by definition inhabits the supernatural realm. But there's a third thing I would like to say, and this to me is the most telling, it's the most significant. You cannot discover personhood or personal information by empirical investigation. I could weigh you, I could measure your height, I could do your body mass index, I could run your DNA sequence, I could check your blood type and your oxygen levels, and all those things. I would learn nothing about you, the person, because personal knowledge is not available by empirical means. I often illustrate this by asking a question. The point here is that personal information comes by self-revelation. It is by observing people and listening to them that you learn about them. And I often ask the question when I talk about this, I say, who in the world do you think knows me the best? And I'll give you a hint. On December 21 of this year, I will have been married to the same woman for 46 years, and we're still on speaking terms. Now, who do you think knows me best? And if you picked my wife, Laura Lee, you would be right. And how did she come to know me? Did she weigh me? Did she check my blood type before she married me? No, the answer is a very interesting one to me because she took a risk. Here was this young man who had come from Africa, attending college. She got acquainted with me first through a picture. When I and two of my brothers arrived at Atlantic Union College, it was enough of a novelty in the middle of winter that we ended up in a picture on the front page of the student paper. And my wife, who at that time was in her last year of academy, saw that picture. And the thought crossed her mind. She says, I think that the young man on the right is the one who will be my husband. She had no idea who I was, only what was in the story, see. I saw her for the first time on a camping trip. And my first interactions with her occurred on a hike. On a Sabbath afternoon, we hiked up a hill, Crotchet Mountain, if you've been to New Hampshire. On the way up, I don't remember much at all. On the way down, this young woman, who I had never met before, ended up in line in front of me. And all the way down, we had a few little interchanges. She told me later that that was a strategic move on her part. So young ladies, I might just drop a hint that sometimes the men need a little help in noticing your existence. See? And after that day, I had in my mind that there was this young woman who I thought was beautiful and interesting, and we became acquainted over time. But college proceeded. She came to college. We went to college together for some years. I'm older than she is, and so I got set to graduate. And we had to have this conversation that oftentimes takes place in relationships. What's going to happen now? She has to finish college, and I'm going off to seminary. What will we do? And so we had this conversation one day. We were talking back and forth, and I'm pretty sure she's the one who raised the question, well, do you think marriage might work? Again, remember the young men sometimes need help. See? And so we talked that for a while, and I remember we were sitting in the living room of her parents' home, and I said to her, well, would you consider marrying me? She said, if you're asking, yes. See? And so we agreed there. There was no big episode. And by the way, I got to commiserate with the young men today. I've noticed that engagements have to be grand affairs. You have to have this big production to propose. And I remember the proposal I made was a simple question I asked in the living room while we were having a conversation, and it worked fine, by the way. See? And you understand that based on whatever information she had, she took the risk of accepting the proposal. And so she has journeyed with me. We have journeyed together. We've lived in the same place. We've eaten the same food. We've slept in the same bed. We've raised the same children. We have journeyed together through all kinds of life experiences to the point that she knows me. She knows what clothes I like. She knows what food I like. She even knows how much of it I like. She can anticipate my thoughts sometimes before I say them, which is a little unnerving, by the way, and if you've been married a long time, you understand how that works, right? See? And of course, I know her well. But that did not come by empirical investigation. It came by associating together, by observing me and my ways, by listening to me talk, sometimes even to the point of foolishness. That's how you gain information about a person. And in view of that fact, if you're looking for evidence for God, you ought not to be trying to do experiments on Him as much as you ought to be asking the question, if I look into history, do I encounter any possibly credible evidences that God has appeared in history in ways that humans can understand? And the minute you raise that question, you run into some very interesting information, very interesting events. You run into many, many claims. Some of them are obviously spurious. But of particular interest to me are those experiences or instances of humans who have knowledge of God that seems to go beyond the merely cognitive. It goes to the visceral. It is a life-changing event. They speak of some occasion where they had an encounter with God that was totally transformative. And their lives are changed. For them it becomes not only a life-altering, but a matter of life and death to proclaim what they have experienced. And this has happened, of course, in history past. But sometimes it happens even today. And I recite to you a very interesting experience I had in 2003. I was in the African country of Zambia with a group of students. We were there doing some evangelistic preaching, and I was paired up with a local evangelist. He was a farmer by trade. He was a big man. His name was Noah Penyasanyi. He was bigger than I am by several inches, and he was as strong as an ox. One day I remember pushing on his shoulder just in fun to see if it would dent, and it didn't even dent. This guy was a fearsome preacher. I would preach the message, and then he would make the invitation, and I'll tell you what, the devils were on the run when that man got to speaking because of the way he so forcefully proclaimed. But anyway, one day he said to me, he says, Dr. Thomas, it would be much worse for me to abandon my faith than for you to give up yours. Well, that sounded like a nonsensical statement to me. He said it 3 or 4 times, and one day I finally said, Noah, you keep telling me this. Why do you say that? And he says, I will tell you. He said, I had a very difficult upbringing because my father was a drunkard and he was not home often, and when he was home he was very abusive, and so I grew up a very angry young man. And he said, because I got to be a big young man and very strong, people were afraid of me because I was angry. And one day one of the men in the village said to him, Noah, you need to find a channel for your anger. And so they got him involved in boxing. And he said, at first I didn't like boxing, but then he said, I began to enjoy it. Because I realized that I could play with my opponent for 2 or 3 rounds, and then he says, I'd knock him out with one fist. Well, that's a pretty tough life if you're the opposition, you know. But Noah began to thrive on this, and he began to be noticed. And wouldn't you know, of all things, one day a promoter from Europe happened to be traveling through. He was looking for big, strong young men who could get into the boxing thing, and so he visited the club where Noah was boxing, and he was quite impressed. He said to him, Noah, I'm going back to Europe, and I'm going to spend some time and money getting the permission for you to come and box in the European circuit. And he says, you might even be able to make it onto the world stage because you're that good. Now, Noah was living a very rough life. He said, I was a very evil man. And so while he waited for the permissions to come to go and box in Europe, he went home to his mother's home. His mother was getting old and somewhat feeble. And an evangelist happened to come to town. And the mother said to him, Noah, I am an old lady. I want to hear this man. But I can't go by myself, so you are my son. You need to take me. And so, out of respect for his mother, Noah would take her to the tent where the meetings were happening, and he would drop her off, and then he would go away a short distance. Well, it so happened that as the preacher preached with great vigor, Noah began to listen. And before too long, he was not outside the tent, he was inside the tent. And by the time the meetings ended, he had come under a very strong conviction that the way he was going was very destructive and that he ought to abandon it. And when the preacher made a call for baptism and for conversion, to his mother's great shock and joy, Noah went forward. Well, they arranged the baptism, and you need to know that in Zambia they don't baptize 2 or 3 people, they baptize 200 or 300 people at a time. It's a very religious country. And by the way, the Seventh-day Adventist Church is the largest church in that country now. It exceeds all other ones. You can hardly go to a village in that country without finding an Adventist church. And Noah told me that on the day of his baptism, there was a line of about 140 people that were baptizing in a little stream. And there was a minister, 2 ministers were baptizing, and people often wear white clothes on the day they're baptized, and they often take a Bible name when they're baptized. And Noah joined the line, but he said, I went to the back of the line. He said, I didn't want to be in the front because I was afraid. He said, I have lived such an evil life. He said, I'm afraid that when I come to be baptized, that God may wreak justice on me and strike me down. That was his thought. And as the line moved up, Noah's stress got worse and worse. When he was about 3 or 4 people away from the baptism, he was in such distress that he said to me, Doctor, he said, I folded my hands and I looked up to heaven and I said, God, please be merciful to me. I am a great sinner. And he said, in that moment, it was as if the sky opened. And he said, I saw the face of Jesus, and Jesus looked at me and he smiled. And then he said, the sky closed. And he said, in that moment, I was overcome by joy and the realization that God is not against me, but he is for me. And he said, I became a baptized church member, and very soon after that, he said, I began to preach. And this guy preaches 2 or 3 evangelistic campaigns a year by himself. Okay. Now, I don't know what you think of his story. I cannot prove, and he cannot prove that he saw Jesus. Maybe it was a hallucination. But I'm going to tell you what, that there's one person who is never going to suggest that to him. Okay? Because this man was absolutely convinced that he had seen God inside of history, and it was transformative to the very depths of his soul. Okay. That man, and I look at those things, and that's a modern story. But there are people all the way down through history who make kind of claims like that, some of which have been recorded and preserved. See? And I've thought about it. I think those kind of claims are protected. First of all, by the high cost of making the claim that you have had a direct interaction with God. You imagine if you come to church next week and you tell your fellow church members, you know, I had a vision during the week. God came to me and He spoke to me. And actually He has a message for the rest of you. I'm not sure how you would react, or actually I am pretty sure how you would react. The first thing you would do is you would dish up a high dose of skepticism, right? And you say, well, I wonder what that person had the night before for supper, right? Or I wonder if they drank something. This is highly unusual. You would be skeptical. And so anybody who wants to make those claims, and I think this has been true throughout history, if you make that kind of a claim, you're subject to suspicion and ostracism. You're one of the crazy people in the world. See? And if that claim is to stand the test of history, a second thing has to happen. That person has to gain credibility in the believing community for that idea to be preserved. In other words, you would have to win over your fellow church members that your experience is a credible one and it's genuine, and only after that would it enter the record of history as something viable and permanent. Personal information is not discovered by empirical means. It's uncovered or discovered by interaction between minds and people. And that's a happy thing for me to be able to say to you what you already know. That down through history, there are many instances where this has been preserved and written down. And so you read, for example, in the Bible, Paul's comment to the Corinthians that all of those things happened and they are preserved for our admonition upon whom the end of the age have come. And we know Peter's well-known and celebrated comment that he wrote to the Christians, that we didn't follow cunningly invented fables when we talked to you about the Savior. We saw this with our own eyes. And then he cites also the record of prophecy. And what about Hebrews 11, one of the great chapters of the Bible? We're beginning way back in time. The author recites instances where people had interaction with God and that they lives were affected by it, and they wrote them down. And they endured deprivation. And I like the way that chapter ends, where the writer says, I don't have enough time to tell you about all these people, but they endured all kinds of deprivation. They were murdered and they were cut in half and they were burned and all these things. The world was not worthy of them. See? And you see, folks, it's because of the historicity of the Bible that our faith is anchored in history, not just in imaginings. You and I as Christians see the Bible as a credible document because it's tied to experiences in history, and we trust the veracity of the people who had those claims and the communities that they served, that they preserved them. And so I'm not just relying on the ideas of some guru somewhere. My faith is not built just on some experimentation that was done. It's not built on some form of mystical meditation that nobody else can understand. It's built on historical events where people like you and like me were absolutely persuaded that God had been active, and sometimes on pain of death wrote those down and preserved them. And ours is a faith where there has been an accumulation of those things, and we today rely on them. Christianity is a system of thought and belief and action that has grown up out of the acceptance of the claims of those who in the past have said that they had encounters with God. I, for one, am very happy about that. The history has great significance in the Christian world. It is not just a passage of time. We accept their testimony as true and credible. Their testimony compiled creates a worldview from which we draw our reference points. And let's keep in mind, folks, that the Bible is a residual record. I like to make this point. I tell people it's a sufficient document. It is not an exhaustive document. We make a big mistake when we think the Bible speaks to every issue in life. It's a sufficient document. There's enough there to engender and build and sustain faith, but there's not enough there to answer every question you have. It gives us not absolute certainty, but grounds for proper confidence. See, You and I can have confidence in the truthfulness of the Scriptures. I like what T.M. Kitwood said, and I have to tell you about T.M. Kitwood. T.M. Kitwood, I don't know the man. He wrote a book, What is Human? I bought it for 50 cents at a used book sale. The title intrigued me. It turns out when he wrote that book, he was a chemistry teacher working at the University of Uganda in Jinja. That struck me because Jinja is a town where the Nile River runs out of Lake Victoria and heads on its long journey up to Egypt, and there's a hydroelectric dam there. And I remember as a boy we were traveling through there, and my father took the time to stop, and we all went through this big hydroelectric scheme with the big turbines. And so when I read Jinja, I thought, oh, this guy's in Jinja, huh? I have a memory attached to that. Well, I read the book, and I have to tell you that the last section of that book, in which this chemistry teacher reflects on Christianity, is one of the most profound descriptions of Christianity I've ever read. He's not even a theologian. T.M. Kitwood. This is what he says here about the evidences of Christianity. None of these evidences, and he's citing a long line of them that people always talk about, none of these evidences, inductive, historical, pragmatic, is in itself sufficient to compel assent. None of them is complete by itself, but they do all converge. It is this, rather than any single argument in isolation, that forms the intellectual case for the truth of Christianity. There are many lines of thought that converge, and as I read that, I was reminded of what has become my favorite poem. It's a poem by Robert Frost. It's entitled The Silken Tent. It's about a canvas tent that is set up and standing there with its poles and its guy ropes and all that kind of stuff. And I earned my way through college partly by working with tents at camp meetings. So I was interested in this, and I'm going to read it to you here, because to me it's a statement about religion as well. It reads like this: She is as in a field a silken tent, at midday when a sunny summer breeze has dried the dew and all its ropes relent, so that in guise it gently sways at ease, and its supporting central cedar pole, that is its pinnacle to heavenward and signifies the sureness of the soul, seems to owe naught to any single cord, but strictly held by none, is loosely bound by countless silken ties of love and thought to everything on earth the compass round, and only by one's going slightly taut in the capriciousness of summer air is of the slightest bondage made aware. I like this poem. It's about a tent that is kind of hanging loosely in the summer sun, held up by poles and individual cords, any one of which is not absolutely critical to its standing. That's, I think, how our faith is substantiated. There are many lines of evidence that converge, that are based on what's recorded in the Scripture, and on that case we have points of reference for our living. I think it's important to say today that the Bible should be taken as a complete document. There are some people who like to section it and break it up, and I like to tell the story of Old Dan. Old Dan was a farmer in the Appalachian Mountains. He was an uneducated man, a very devout churchgoer. And one day a new young man came to his parish, the new preacher, and I am not here to disparage young preachers. I was one once myself. But this young preacher came with some novel ideas. He told the congregation that the book of Revelation is undecipherable, that it cannot be understood. He told them also that the Old Testament really is not for Christians, it's for the Jewish people. He told them that some portions of the Gospels are inauthentic. And so Dan, being a pragmatic person, decided to follow the advice of the preacher, and so he removed the book of Revelation from his Bible. He said, if it's not understandable, I don't need it. And he excised the Old Testament, saying, well, if it's not for me, I don't need to carry it around. And then he blacked out portions of the New Testament that were said to be inauthentic. And one day as he was coming into church, the young preacher was greeting everybody, and Dan had his rather mutilated Bible under his arm. And the eye of the preacher fell on this Bible as he came in the door, and the preacher reached out and said, hey, let me see that. And he looked at it, and with a sense of horror said to the old man, what have you done? And the old man with a kind of a steely-eyed squint looked back at the young preacher and he said, "Well, sir, I'm a very pragmatic man. And when you said the Old Testament is not for Christians, I got rid of mine. And when you said Revelation is inscrutable, he said, I took mine out. And then he reached for his Bible and he took it back. And he said, when you said portions of the Gospels are inauthentic, I blacked them out. But he said, my biggest worry, sir, is that you ain't done with the Bible yet. You're not done dismantling it." See? And I tell that story. It's probably apocryphal. I don't know that it's even true. But stories don't have to be true to make a point. That we eviscerate the Bible by other means sometimes when we ought to treat it as a whole. It's a document that has been compiled over time. And I want to say to you, good people here, that there's a misconception about the Bible that some committee somewhere sat down and put it together. That's not true. The Bible is a collection of books that became accepted as authoritative in the believing community and so were codified. Okay. There was not some committee that sat down and said these will be included and these will not. This is a general acceptance methodology that was used here. And it is by consulting this book that you and I derive reference points for our living, reference points that make it possible for us to live sensibly and with purpose and with anticipation of a good destiny. I was reminded many years ago of how important a fixed point of reference is. I was blessed to have a head elder who bought a new sailboat. And I happen to like sailing. I don't get to do much of it, but I like sailing. And this man discovered that I like sailing, and so he took it upon himself as the head elder of the church to take the pastor out twice a year for 3 or 4 days at a time, sailing on the Connecticut coast, down Long Island Sound. One day we decided to sail over to Block Island, which is an island about, 8 or so miles offshore. It was a wonderful afternoon. We left in the sun. There was a nice breeze. We were sailing somewhat downwind, which is always a bit tricky when you have to deal with waves. The waves were running 3 or 4 feet. We had to pay attention. Our journey there was made somewhat exciting when a mayday call came over the radio that a little fishing boat we had seen going the other way, an old wooden boat, had sprung a plank and was going down, and it was quite dramatic to hear them calling for help and becoming quite agitated. We couldn't see them, but the Coast Guard finally came out, and there were no records of death the next day, so we assumed that they were rescued. But as the evening came, we sailed into Block Island Harbor, and Block Island has a very secure harbor. There's about a 1-mile channel that you sail into, and then it's pretty much landlocked. There's a bay inside the island, and we sailed up as far as we could, and then we motored up to a place where we were going to anchor for the night. And the elder had a brand new boat, had a big mortgage on it. And so we were going to ride to our own anchor and save the $35 fee for tying up to a mooring that the marina had. And in looking at the charts that he had with him, the captain said, well, the charts say that the holding power of this soil here is not very good. So it was that he nosed up to one of those big red buoys that float out there. And I took over the bow 2 1-inch nylon ropes with rubber chafing gear attached. I put them up through the chocks on the front of that boat and attached them to a big 6-inch stainless steel cleat that was through-bolted on the foredeck. Put them both on there. And then we went ashore and we walked around the island a while. And we came back and had a sumptuous meal. I remember the meal well because the man was a very good cook. It was Italian shells, stuffed shells with homemade salsa, very good. And then as night came, we said a prayer and commended ourselves to the care of the Almighty, and we went to sleep. We went to sleep, that is, until about 2 o'clock in the morning, when I was awakened by a strange sound of the cables that pull up the mast, called halyards. They were slapping against the aluminum mast, making noise. It woke me up. And very quickly that sound became incessant. It got louder and louder and more rapid, and the boat began to pitch around and heave, and the captain and I, our feet hit the deck at the same time. We jumped to the hatchway and looked out, and what a sight met our eyes. There were waves with whitecaps being blown off of them. There was spindrift and spume, and boats were reeling back and forth. And we thought, what in the world has happened here? And we watched because it seemed to us like our vessel had broken loose because it seemed to have a mind of its own. And then both he and I noticed something, that every swing to port was met by a corresponding swing to starboard, was met by a corresponding swing to port, which meant only one thing, that the bow of the boat was still attached to something. That's why it would swing both ways, not just one. And so we went back to sleep again. The weather calmed down. We found out the next day that a front had blown through with winds gusting to 55 miles an hour. And when we got up in the morning, fully 1/3 of the boat in that anchorage were up in the marshes on the other side. They were beached on the other side of the harbor. But we had been fine because we had been attached to a fixed point of reference, something that held us in place. And I remembered that as a life lesson. Fixed points of reference, folks, are very good things to have, not just when building buildings, not just when flying in airplanes, not just when sailing boats. They are very good things. They are essential to living well. I think Edward Paxmore had it right. And you want to know, well, who is Edward Paxmore? Edward Paxmore is a quasi-historical character in one of James Michener's books. And I don't know how many of you have ever read any James Michener's books. They tend to be about 1,000 pages long. This one is from the book on Chesapeake. And Edward Paxmore is a figure who is based on a historical figure, but of course embellished for purposes of description. But this is what it said about Edward Paxmore. In his personal life, Edward Paxmore had discovered that a man lived best when he maintained some central belief upon which he could hang all action and to which he could refer all difficult moral problems. He had observed that men and women who failed to develop this central belief wandered and made hideously wrong decisions because in time of crisis they had nothing to which they could refer. He had found his backbone in belief and in obedience to God. I think that's time-tested advice. I'm here today to encourage you to follow it and to keep following it until our eyes behold the King himself.
Quaked before, moved by the sound of his voice, and seas that are shaken and stirred can be calmed and broken through my regard. Through it all, my eyes are on you. Through it all, it is well. Through it all, my eyes are on you, and it is well with me.
And now may you grow in grace and in the knowledge of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. To him be glory both now and through all eternity. Amen. You are all invited. We have a fellowship dinner, Thanksgiving theme, over in the gym. If you'd like to go over there, feel free to get in line. They'll have a prayer once 15 or 20 of you are there, and that way you can just go ahead and get started eating. And then we'll meet back in here at 2 o'clock for our afternoon session, which is going to be dealing with science and religion. So you won't want to miss that one. Happy Sabbath.